everyone. This is Paul Caiazzo, SVP of Corporate Development here at Avertium. Welcome to Scaling Remediation in the Face of Competing Priorities. We're co-presenting today with our partner Digital Defense. Here at Avertium, our promise is to help you guys show no weakness on the face of cybersecurity adversity. So we do this by creating white papers, virtual events, resources like that. And if you'd like to subscribe to our content, you can do that at avertium.com. So without further ado, let's get started. Today's webinar is going to be presented by me, Paul Caiazzo, and Sanjay Raja of Digital Defense. A little bit about myself. I am, again, our SVP of Corporate Development, and I'm also our CISO. I have about 25 years of cybersecurity experience ranging a pretty broad range of disciplines. We do 24/7 security monitoring here at Avertium, and so getting a view into threats is something that's always interesting to me. I really do try to keep my my hands dirty, so to speak. So Sanjay, thanks for joining me today. Let's go on camera, and maybe if you could give a quick background on yourself, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Paul. So I work on strategy and also technical marketing and alliances and partnerships at Digital Defense. Digital Defense is very focused on vulnerability management and threat assessment solutions. Been here for a couple of years now, but we're all been in the security space, starting to get towards about 20 years now at this point. So it's been a lot of fun over that time.
Indeed, yeah. So, fun. Let's talk about some fun. So fun is stopping the bad guys, and I think a great way to do that is by really inspecting how you manage risk inside your technical environment. And that's really the focus of today. We know that organizations struggle to keep up with vulnerability management. There are some strategies that you can employ to improve that sort of experience and your overall progress within your security program. That's really what we're going to be diving into today. This is all about scale. We know that a lot of organizations have just millions of vulnerabilities in some cases. I've seen some pretty bad situations where there literally are millions of vulnerabilities. And the question I always get from those CISOs is, how do I keep up with this? How can we possibly address remediation in a prioritized manner when we just have so big a problem to solve? And that's really what we're hoping to cover today. So hopefully the audience takes away from this some strategies that you guys can employ in your own environment. But let's talk about some of the problems that we have to solve. And I think starting with just a perspective of what really the key issues are is always important. And for me, I break it down into kind of these three key areas. And if you think about the problem that I think the cybersecurity industry has had since its beginning is the concept of siloed data. Right, so we have vulnerability scanning tools that aren't well integrated into the security program at large. Perhaps we're not taking value from the information the vulnerability tool provides to do things like contextual threat detection, things along those lines. And it really impairs the value of the different technology investments that organizations have made when you don't intermesh those tools into sort of that single fabric. I often also see people look at vulnerability scanning and vulnerability management as just simply a compliance requirement that they have to do. That check the box approach, it may address the audit requirement, but it really doesn't move the needle for security posture. And that ultimately ends up creating sort of a false sense of security because, oh, well, we do vulnerability scanning. It doesn't actually equate to a more secure environment unless you're able to actually remediate the results. And as I talked about, that can be challenging for organizations with a large environment or a large sort of problem to solve with respect to scanning an infrastructure that might be diverse across cloud and work from home and on-prem and all that sort of stuff. And then the other thing I often see is that most of today's modern security tools they can be integrated and orchestrated and automated to the extent that it creates sort of a high degree of automation, right? So enabling the results from the vulnerability scan to be piped directly into the workflow for remediation. That's where we all want to get. Unfortunately, most organizations haven't really looked at that automation. That's what I view of, or what I think of when I looking at silo breaking. I don't know, Sanjay, what thoughts do you have with respect to that?
Yeah, it definitely is an issue where vulnerability management is kind of on its own island, and the patch teams, vulnerability teams, they kind of work separately in a lot of cases, not integrated, as you mentioned, into the overall security program. And really the information that's provided there, if there's the right context, right data that is provided to the security team, can really help with remediation efforts. So, as much as that's kept separate and said, okay, well, we have this practice here, but we really don't leverage it the way we should, it's pretty surprising me in some ways, because being able to patch vulnerabilities and handle vulnerable and at-risk systems is really the first line of defense before an attacker can start to compromise those assets and start to get into the network itself. So, the fact that it's not as integrated into the security program really surprised me in some ways. But again, I think a lot of it is that because of resource issues and really how legacy systems have been built over time as well. So I think it's a combination of the systems themselves and also, how the programs have been structured. So I think those are two areas where they've been siloed just because of those reasons.
Yeah, I agree. And also that sort of siloing and tying it back to that check the box compliance, I think we have to answer the question, why do we scan for vulnerabilities? More so than what is the process or what outcome we're trying to drive. The why really is that bad guys, they're often focused on exploiting vulnerabilities that are released in Microsoft Patch Tuesday, for instance. I had an interesting conversation with the U.S. Secret Service lead of the cybercrime task force, who, in interviewing a convicted felon at that point, asked how he acquired targets. And what was interesting about the response the criminal gave him was that basically he waits for Patch Tuesday to come around, looks at the most serious RCE or remote code execution vulnerabilities, and then goes and scans the internet looking for them out on the internet at large. So that's really what we're combating here, and reducing that time to remediate is really a key thing that helps protect an organization from a security posture standpoint. And then as well, the integration and automation that can really drive performance and drive scale is just not being done in most places. And I think some of that is due to some of the blind spots that we see, right? So I think probably everybody on this call has some mix of on-prem infrastructure with some cloud, whether that's infrastructure as a service in Azure or AWS, or maybe they're using some SaaS software. That complexity can be difficult to keep up with from a scanning standpoint. And often if you're looking at this from a traditional standpoint, you're thinking, well, I've got to be concerned about vulnerabilities in my data center. But when you've got everybody working from home, how are you handling scanning those devices, right? Because they introduce risk to the environment just as much, if not more so, than the stuff that's in the data center. Typically, that stuff is going to be behind some additional firewalling or some other segmentation, which may reduce the potential for risk to be sort of propagate across that network. But the device that's in somebody's house that's interacting directly with the internet, perhaps through a split tunnel VPN, is going to introduce vulnerabilities to the environment, which will allow attacker to pivot over into the corporate environment at large. And again, every time you add complexity, you're sort of fighting against security. And often organizations just aren't really considering the security elements of these technology decisions they're making. And I think that's evident when you start thinking about shadow IT or legacy IT that people think just simply can't be patched, or maybe it runs some application that can't afford any amount of downtime, so they elect to not scan it and then not ultimately patch it. And I think that's really dangerous. That creates again these blind spots of risk that it's simply not possible to understand what the actual risk posture of the organization is and what those unknowns are. So what do you think about that, Sanjay? Do you think that blind spots are something that are common in the people that you're talking to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue. I mean, you look at a lot of the ransomware or even some of the malware strains that are out there, and very often it's because people didn't know about certain systems or they didn't know how to track them appropriately. There are cases where they just haven't even scanned them frequently. There's a lot of the scan programs out there will do quarterly scanning or even even longer periods. I've seen a lot of customers that do scanning every 6 months. As you pointed out, there are new vulnerabilities always coming up, whether it's a Microsoft Tuesday or even in other areas as well for other systems. So there's a constant flurry of new vulnerabilities that are being discovered and exploits that are being created, and yet your understanding of your risk and vulnerabilities in the environment are you really don't have good visibility into those because of how infrequent the scanning is. But to your point about remote networks is that as the rush has been there to increase infrastructure and start to modify infrastructure, a lot of it goes more towards cloud and other areas. There's been a lack of being able to track these assets and new resources that are now online. But the other issue too is that security hasn't been baked in early, primarily because they've scaled those so quickly, they haven't been able to have security to keep up. So the ability to scale security is going to be part of the topic we're talking about today is how to do that effectively and quickly as your infrastructure evolves. And that can be very complicated, for a customer to be able to do with the resources they have. So, that's a great point. That does create visibility gaps in terms of your security posture quickly.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, closing down those visibility gaps has got to be, sort of priority number one, not just from a vulnerability standpoint, but just risk in general. Threat detection becomes more and more challenging as that sprawl sort of increases. And I think the situation we're all in with work from everywhere and everybody working from home really complicates threat detection. And I know that customers that we talk to struggle to implement the right technology or the right processes and procedures to first off uncover that risk, but then ultimately do something about it. Right, and that scaling of that remediation aspect of it is even more challenging now than it was prior to the pandemic.
Yeah.
I think another thing. Go ahead.
One other thing too is that even just the training of the security staff and the people to be able to handle the changes that are there, right? You're shifting how you do business in a lot of ways by the fact that you've got this distributed workforce and, like I said, getting access from anywhere, everywhere. Just again, being able to get the teams that are involved in security to understand those changes and be able to handle those environments is again a challenge too. That takes some time as well. So again, it goes back to the scalability even of the security program to handle that in that sense too. So that's a great point.
Yeah, and I think actually what you just said ties directly into governance as well, because if security is really sort of top of mind or within the governance framework for the organization, things like technology initiatives, security will be a key requirement of them. It seems self-explanatory or just common sense probably to the security interested audience that's on this call, but very likely the audience has been in situations where security is an afterthought. And at that point, when you get to a stage like that, it just becomes more and more challenging to overlay the right sort of process and procedure and govern it so that it's a continuously operating process that's threaded into the overall security program. I think what drives that in my experience is that there's, as we say here, that lack of alignment. So risk tolerance is a key thing. We have to know how much risk an organization is willing to accept or can accept. And it's going to be different for every organization. And most of my experience don't go through the process of understanding what their risk appetite is. Why that's important is because you shouldn't be, rushing to remediate more quickly than the risk acceptance will, sort of drive. So if you're in a very, low risk tolerant environment, so you can't really accept any risk, then yes, you have to be patching, those critical vulnerabilities within 72 hours, something like that. And that right there, if you establish that and it's understood and accepted by leadership, is going to help prioritize resources to align with the vulnerability management program. And if you don't do that, if you haven't put that effort in, then there's going to be this expectation that scanning is going to follow closely or be followed closely by remediation. And there will be that sort of disconnect between how quickly things need to be patched, driving how frequently things need to be scanned. Because generally, my recommendation when people ask me how often should I be scanning is, well, first off, what does your compliance mandate tell you have to do? And some are going to say you have to do it quarterly. Some might say we only have to do it once a year. But as you pointed out, that's utterly inadequate because new vulnerabilities are released every day. And if you're only doing it once a year, that snapshot in time is not going to do any good. But if taking that compliance mandate one step further, I don't think organizations should be trying to scan more frequently than they can remediate. So if you start looking at the metrics that matter here around what's my mean time to remediate, that's where you start seeing opportunities to improve. And that could be through orchestration and automation. It could be through better prioritization with enriched data. A lot of ways to skin the cat, but that's really the guidance I often give is don't scan more frequently than you can remediate. And again, all that boils into sort of a well-governed vulnerability management program and really ultimately a well-governed security program.
Agree. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Is that the frequency of scanning, you're just going to increase your patch list to intolerable levels. It's going to continue to grow and grow until you can start to get ahead with the remediation part. So it becomes a cat and mouse game, so to speak. So it's really important to be able to align those two together, and shrink the amount of time as well to be able to do that remediation. So you're right, automation and things like that can certainly help with shrinking that remediation time, or even sometimes you call it dwell time. It's a common term. But shrinking that dwell time to be able to remediate whatever you've seen is critical there. But you're right, if you continue to scan, you're just going to see those lists grow and grow, and you're never going to get ahead. And it becomes a lot more difficult to even prioritize what activity to do. So it makes a lot of sense there.
Yeah, and I agree. I think you hit a key point there is that list is going to continue to grow because you're going to have repeat findings. And in my experience, again, people focus on the wrong metrics with vulnerability management. They're looking to drive down the count of vulnerabilities, and that isn't really the right metric to look at. I think speed to remediate is a key one to look at. Overall risk posture for the organization is important to look at, and you can only get there, through applying some, next generation sort of technologies, but then also looking at it in a manner of what does this vulnerability mean to my environment? And that level of contextuality needs to be applied, which can only be done with a really good understanding of your data environment, a really good understanding of your threat profile, incorporating things like threat intelligence and stuff like that into your overall vulnerability management program. Those are really important because they will focus you on the right metrics.
Right, absolutely. I agree that the threat intelligence component is a critical piece of it, where that really gives you the additional context of what's going on in the wild, what's happening in the industry, what sort of attacks are being leveraged right now to be able to get into organizations. That type of data really comes back to help you figure out how to prioritize your efforts around remediation. So, very important part of a next generation vulnerability management program.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well, let's ask the audience what they think here in terms of big problems they're trying to solve. So we'll do a quick poll, so everybody will have an opportunity to answer this poll question. But what do you think the biggest problem you're seeing in your own environment is? Is it lack of asset visibility? Is it that you can't manage just that huge volume? You don't know how to prioritize to actually drive the results you're trying to get to? Automation, you can't implement it or don't know how, or your tools perhaps don't have the ability to be automated, or that remote workforce issue. You're unable to put your finger on, scanning for vulnerabilities in your remote workforce. So I'm going to pose this question to you, Sanjay. What do you think the biggest problem of the ones that we've got here is that your customers are trying to solve?
Yeah, I would say, it's definitely a combination of all these. All these kind of flow to each other in some ways, but, from what I've seen, the biggest thing is the ability to prioritize and scale remediation. That particular area is where it becomes extremely difficult to leave, assets unpatched, or, assets that are under threat, being attacked, et cetera. If you're not able to address those as quickly as possible, especially again with that threat intelligence component that comes in to tell you these are important, these are active things that are going on out there, you need to go and prioritize these assets and prioritize remediation there. When you look at doing that, that's really going to keep you from, a breach, right, or some sort of ransomware attack being successful. So the more you can accelerate and scale that prioritization around remediation efforts is really where things are going to come to play. But again, all these things lead to that, right? The lack of visibility, the huge volumes of vulnerabilities that come up, the inability to automate some of the contextualization of some of the data you're getting to help with remediation. And certainly remote workforce, right? All those things lead to a lot of gaps in terms of being able to have a successful program.
Yeah, they're really intertwined, right? So each one's going to have a knock-on effect on the next. But to me, if I look at this list, I think the one that I would be most focused on is asset visibility, because you can't fix what you don't know about. And that could include the remote workforce. It could include some cloud environments, all that shadow IT that we talked about on the prior slide. With that good visibility, you're going to hopefully be able to drive the results throughout the rest of it. But you are going to have to, sort of uncork the potential of your tools through automation, through good governance and things like that. So all right, let's see what the audience had to think about it. All right, so it looks like, prioritization of results. Yeah, so I think it sounds like the audience has a pretty good feel for what the vulnerabilities are, but unable to actually prioritize the results, which, a good thing you came to this. We are going to talk specifically about that. But, Sanjay, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, I think what people are looking for is, especially as we're talking about adding a vulnerability management program and breaking that silo as it becomes part of their overall threat detection program, that extra risk and context is going to be beneficial to them to be able to prioritize and remediate. So, but it is the quality of data coming in, whether it's visibility data, understanding your assets, that quality of data that's coming in is really going to be able to enable that prioritization and remediation effort. So I'm sure we'll be talking about that as we go forward too.
Yep, we are. We're definitely going to get to that, but that is pretty telling. It seemed to me, based on those results, we did see some people select the remote workforce and asset visibility as well. But like I think we talked about, probably difficult to pick one out of that list of very interconnected issues to solve. Again, one of the things I really always harp on with respect to any sort of security program or process, it has to be well governed. And so I often get the question, what do you mean? What's well-governed? What goes into a well-governed process? So we put this together to highlight really sort of the ITIL model of enabling a service. Part of that is that you have to cover the entire environment, right? So for me, that's not just the stuff that's in the local area network or even my laptop here at home. It's how my team uses cloud, whether that's SaaS or infrastructure or whatever. We have to have visibility into all that. Now, your SaaS providers are probably not going to provide you, a continuous stream of vulnerability data about their environment. But I would certainly be looking, just from a third-party risk management standpoint, at their procedures or perhaps their SOC 2 documentation, which describes how they do vulnerability management, because ultimately you're inheriting that risk from them. That's part of the scope of the scanning job, right? So not just the pressing the button in the vulnerability scanner to fire it off against a set of machines, but identifying what those machines are, the scanning cadence, and again, keep that aligned to the ability to remediate. Deploy the architecture in a manner that's going to enable that level of coverage, and the windows that you're able to scan within. Oftentimes, I hear from customers that we can't scan that particular set of devices at this time of day because there's this process, or this particular day of the month there's a script that's run that we can't impede. All that stuff needs to be known and it needs to be built into the program so that not just the scanning is going to occur in a sort of predictable way, but all of the threat detection tools are not going to see that and mistake it for threat traffic, because I've often seen security operations center teams look at a bunch of port scanning or vulnerability scanning going on and thinking there may be something malicious happening, only because the process wasn't well documented and they didn't know that the scans were going to be kicked off. There's something to be said about profiles as well. So different types of devices should be scanned with different profiles. Oftentimes you'll see vulnerability scanning tool have the ability to do things like configuration baseline scanning. I'd recommend doing that, probably not as frequently as you do just the standard host-based or application vulnerability scan, but it can be a really good part of your overall risk management program, is to include those compliance benchmarks. So maybe a CIS benchmark or something along those lines should be a component of your vulnerability scanning program. And then I often also will guide our customers to consider the change management process in the build out of the program, so that things like approved scan windows are, again, well known to the entire organization. The correct stakeholders know when their devices are going to be scanned. And ultimately there, you can drive the results in terms of remediation based upon knowing who owns what device, what teams own responsibility for fixing problems, all that sort of stuff. And then, the analysis and reporting, I think, is the key thing with respect to prioritization. You can really only do that if you enrich your data with a good perspective of what's actually happening in the world at large. So there's a few key things that we recommend people think about with that enrichment: is what's actively being exploited in the wild, what's weaponized. And it might be the newest stuff, it might not be. It also might not be as relevant to your organization because you don't have a particular piece of technology. So, creating that contextualization of this data is the critical thing to drive that performance. And there are really good ways to do that with incorporation of threat intelligence, with, again, analyzing for what's weaponized, what campaigns or operations are the bad guys actually using right now to attack a specific set of vulnerabilities. And that's the stuff to focus on. That will drive meaningful improvement from a security posture standpoint. And it's, again, shifting the focus to be more threat-based than data-driven. And what I mean by that is, data-driven, in my opinion, is when you look at just that count, you're trying to drive that number down, that statistic down, but you miss the point of vulnerability management for just looking at that. If you take a more threat-based approach, which is, I want to know what's being weaponized against my organization or what potentially could be, focus on that, you really do gain significant security posture improvements from that.
No, that's purple. I mean, we were talking about silo breaking before, and you're right. It's not just being able to get a part of the security program. It's all the components here in terms of how you have a well-governed program where they're linked together between all the different groups, because really it is a group effort, right? Whether it's the security analysts, whether it's the desktop folks, whether the people running the vulnerability scans, they all have to work together to be able to make sure that assets are protected from these external attacks. So very critical there. And as you mentioned, right, it's not just the number of vulnerabilities or even the set of vulnerabilities on an asset. It's really the impact, and understanding the impact it's going to have on the organization, and understanding that impact in terms of your specific assets and what you're trying to run is really critical there, right? Because I can get a high vulnerability score or something on some sort of asset. Sure, the vulnerabilities are bad, but I'm not really running much of this. It's not critical to my environment, so do I care? But that might be on the top of a patch list. That's not going to be very useful to you in terms of preventing an attack. So you're absolutely right that the impact analysis there associated with the risk is really critical in terms of understanding how to protect myself against these attackers.
Yeah, and it's a little bit about the compensating controls that the environment has, right? So if you've got a device that is important and is very well firewalled off, it exists maybe on a single VLAN that only certain types of traffic or certain IPs can interact with it. That there's some additional sort of scrutiny that you want to apply to that device because it's important, but because it's got those controls around it, the risk might not be as high as the CVSS score would indicate. And so that's really what we're talking about with contextualization. Now, The issue there is there's a mindset shift that you need to get. If you're operating this program, the CISO needs to be bought into the fact that we're not necessarily going to focus on the highest CVSS score. We're going to focus on the stuff that's most potentially impactful to us, and we're going to drive risk down that way. So a good metric, again, to track there, first off, is time to remediation just at large. You can break that down by severity, but then also something we call a security GPA. Right. So what is the overall risk to the organization? And you do that by first, when you sort of build this program, right, applying the device criticality to sort of the scanning profiles. Different devices have different levels of risk associated with them. Domain controller is more important to Avertium than my laptop is. So there's going to be different types of scans that could be performed against them. And ultimately, the vulnerabilities that might appear on a domain controller are more important to fix. Versus just, again, the highest severity that might happen to exist. So that's another key thing to think about. When you start doing that, the results that you're going to get out of a tool that can produce that kind of data, you'll be able to see the improvements in that GPA over time. And even a couple of fixes against those critical vulnerabilities on critical assets will drive that security GPA up, which is then a really good metric to be able to take to the board or whomever has ultimate authority over it to say, listen, we are making meaningful progress in overall security program performance, and here's the metric we can show you to prove it. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely gets into that board level discussion, right? And the ability to understand the risk associated and how well a security program is doing for an organization, is very important. And that requires an understanding over time of how things are working. Again, I think you've got here mean time to remediate is a key metric. That's very important there, right? Is understanding that type of data and seeing that burn down, right? It's not just, as you just mentioned, the count of vulnerabilities. It does go back to just not looking at those numbers raw and understanding, again, what the impact is to my specific organization or group. But you're right, over time, you can get a good understanding of how well security operations are performing based on that type of reporting. So it is important to build that into the program itself as a capability. And again, CISOs are able to take that to the CIO or the board or whoever it is and really be able to share that. That's going to help validate the effectiveness of the security program. So it's very meaningful type of reporting and scoring that's provided.
Yep, yeah, I agree. So, we talked about automation a little bit and orchestration. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this because I think there's a couple of key things to think about. We're not talking necessarily about patches just automatically firing off. You could get to that level of sophistication, but oftentimes you don't want to because patches definitely can break stuff. But what you can do is orchestrate workflows. And this is a key thing that I think most organizations don't really implement. So a vulnerability scanning tool could be integrated with something like a ServiceNow or whatever ITSM it is that you're using. And if you do that, the profiling that we talked about on the prior slide of really understanding the environment, who owns it, who's responsible for fixing it, you can start to do things with your workflow tools, which will basically drop the vulnerability result into the correct workflow in your ServiceNow, so that the right team gets the notice that they've got to fix it. They can be given a deadline for it automatically, and then effectively the reporting that comes back out of the orchestration tool can feed back in, to your overall visibility to say, okay, we are doing well. We did get this fixed in within the amount of time that we were given, for that specific severity, that specific device type, and that's, again, that drives some results. I know, Sanjay, I know you had some thoughts that you wanted to talk about on this slide, so why don't you take over from here?
Yeah, there's a few things too. Is that when you look at even in terms of a threat detection program, is that the contextual information and the vulnerability data that's provided to that program as well is critical because as you start to look at threats or emerging attacks that are coming within a particular environment and detect those, you still want to be able to patch those systems to make sure there's not a repeat, there's not a reinfection or respawning the infection or even a spreading of the infection to other assets that are still vulnerable. So again, the vulnerability scanning context in terms of understanding your overall security program is critical, and that's another example that you can see here. That vulnerability is integrated with a SIM core is very important. As that's a framework for being able to understand and detect threats. So very key there. In general, there are constant changes between cloud, on-premise, remote workforce. I mean, we're seeing that they constantly evolve, and being able to scale security against that, evolving, let's say, attack surface, right, is really what's really important here. Is being adaptable to be able to do that, and baking in security and that security programming to be able to handle these changes is key. The other element too is that it's the SOC, right? It's the people that are there as well. The analysts are the other key to this whole thing, is that the ability to have people that can look at this information, understand it, be able to take that data, contextualize it, whether it's through automation or even by their own expertise, and be able to bring that together to be able to remediate more quickly is critical too. So, outside of building the program and infrastructure, a lot of it is around, how do I get resources and people that can, help to accelerate this program and basically perform the remediation itself or provide the recommendations that are needed. So we definitely don't want to discount the key people that are there to be able to do that. Up in the top left there in the SOC, as you can see on this particular image. But I think those are all work together very effectively.
Yeah. I do agree with that. And you raise a couple of additional interesting points with respect to when you start integrating some of these tools together, that silo breaking we were talking about. So vulnerability data imported into a SIM can really make for some interesting threat detection capability because, for instance, if I see an exploit that is, on the wire on my network because I'm using a network IDS and that hits my SIM, but I see that it's targeting a device that doesn't have that particular vulnerability, maybe it's less severity or lower severity alert. It's something that has to be looked at, but it might not be the house is on fire. Whereas, the alternative to that, if I see that same exploit, trying to hit a device that I know does have that vulnerability, then that is a really big problem. That's kind of going and be fixed right now. So it will drive, additional, sort of intelligence into your remediation strategy to do that. And that could be where that contextual data comes from to help you determine which are the risks that need to be remediated first. That's scale because it might not, again, be necessarily we're focused on driving down the number of vulnerabilities, but you're driving down the ones that matter the most because you have that additional data. And most organizations, if they do have a SIM, they have some threat intelligence that's fed into that. If that can be passed back to the vulnerability scanning tool, then so much the better, because you can just get that data directly in the tool itself. Some tools do allow for that. I know Digital Defenses does, and ingests threat intelligence directly into the platform itself, which is it's a key thing. The other thing about this slide that I always like to talk about is we have these different buckets of device types or environment types, and they all have a different type of risk profile. Even within them, there are some differences in risk profile. A traveling workforce, right? So if you've got somebody that travels around quite often, they're often going to be on hostile networks or just untrusted networks. If you start applying that zero trust approach to how you look at your environment at large, that will also feed into your vulnerability scanning capability, because most of the zero trust technologies that are out there, especially the ones that are software-defined perimeter focused, they will have the ability to scan a device, for things like misconfigurations or the correct scanning engine or signatures or things like that prior to allowing any sort of network access whatsoever. And again, that mesh that you create when you start integrating these different tools and processes together really drives some significant performance. In the cloud environment, one thing to think about as well is, especially if we're looking at like an infrastructure as a service like AWS, you're going to have EC2 instances that need to be scanned for vulnerabilities and remediated, as well as infrastructure like S3 buckets. And a problem that often comes up, and it creates a lot of data breaches, is misconfigured S3 buckets. So that's got to be part of your strategy for addressing risk across the organization itself. It's not really like a host level vulnerability like you might consider it to be, but it's a cloud configuration that could create that potential data exposure, which is ultimately what we're trying to drive down to. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Sanjay, if that's something you guys look at.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we are looking at more and looking to partner more with it. It is something where we're seeing a lot more environments that require understanding of cloud capabilities. And while we do have quite a few clients that will still patch certain systems within cloud environments specifically, or AWS and Azure are two of them certainly that we work with. That is an area that we're seeing emerging a lot more, and we're seeing a lot more attackers go after those environments more effectively. But you're right, a lot of it is around misconfiguration. Even outside of that, if they're long-lived, applications and things like that don't necessarily aren't as transient, they still require patching effort and things like that. So we see a hybrid of both traditional vulnerabilities being addressed in the cloud, and then we're seeing these new class again around misconfiguration, things like that. So it's a combination of both. But yeah, we're definitely work with both those type of environments.
Yep, it's part of the overall sort of risk of the organization, and you have to distill all that together to again focus the remediation on the stuff that matters. All right, so we've talked about maturity a little bit, and when I think about how to scale an organization's maturity, I try to look at it against a continuum of different things. First off, you've got technologies, which on this slide are highlighted in red, and then you've got either processes, procedures, or areas that need governance, and those are highlighted in blue. So you'll note that the vulnerability scanning stuff that's on here is blue because really I consider that to be about the process and about the so again the governance of it more so than necessarily the tool itself. But there are some specific features that you want to make sure you do have within your vulnerability scanning tools. You'll note that when we look at vulnerability scanning on this, at least from our perspective, maturity is built upon increased frequency. So perhaps at a very low level of maturity, you're just doing this once a year, along with the penetration test that some third party does for you. Hopefully you're doing internal if that's you, and as well as external. I know like PCI, for instance, will only really requires you to do an external vulnerability scan once per quarter. To me, again, that sort of completely misses the point. The entirety of the environment has to be scanned for vulnerabilities, but you progress up the chain by doing it more frequently. The underlying sort of element there is that you're keeping up with remediation along the way as well. And one thing to think about when you're looking at something like this is, if you're struggling to figure out, how to scale maturity across your security program at large, it's good to get the foundational stuff right before you start thinking about some very advanced technology, which may be, the next great thing that you're reading all about, AI and ML and predictive analytics or deception from a threat detection standpoint. Those are great, but I don't think an organization that hasn't built maturity through each of these gateways can really take advantage of that stuff. Now, there could be one up in that optimized dynamic area that you want to draw further down, and that's the threat intelligence fed vulnerability scanning. Sanjay, I know you have some opinions on that, so let's hear about that.
Yeah, you've got it perfectly here where, again, you're not going to get to the optimized necessarily overnight, but there is an approach to starting to build that program up. And that's really, what it is. Getting the first stage, and as you progress through the stages is important. You can build on that to improve the program. But, as you mentioned, it's really about the frequency. And when we talk about the frequency, that's really enabling faster remediation to occur, right? You've got a better understanding of your risks, you have a better understanding of what threats are going on, and that allows you, and you're gaining additional context, that allows you to be able to come up with what the plan is and game plan to be able to go remediate more effectively. So yeah, as part of that, as you get to that point, certainly the threat intelligence can accelerate that across things, because again, now you're getting better contextual data around what's going on, what's occurring in the wild, and more importantly, how the things and attacks that are happening that could go after your systems and how they're vulnerable are coming up in terms of exactly what your assets are and how the things that are going on in the wild can impact those assets. And really that's what it's about, right? I just don't want to see, let me scan for every threat out there, and whether they're relevant to me, I get some sort of alert or some sort of false positive on that. That doesn't really matter to me, right? That just causes more noise for me. So a lot of the threat intelligence component being fed in vulnerability scanning reduces that noise and really lets me focus on exactly where I need to focus my efforts, whether it's a security team, a SOC team that's looking for threats, whether it's a vulnerability patching team. It does allow me to do that type of focus on what I need to do immediately and as quickly as possible to protect my organization. So, I think that's critical across all of them, but certainly, should be part of a more mature security program, as you scale.
Yeah, and I think, when I first put this together, my thought process of putting that, up in the optimized or dynamic state was that most of the tools that I was, familiar with or had encountered lacked that capability. And so when you start looking at needing to either integrate, different tools, maybe there's some custom development required to do it. That's sort of a barrier that I think people don't want to sort of slam against unless they've achieved a lot of other stuff. But that's not the case anymore, and I think that more and more tools do have that capability. I want to talk about that a little bit, and I also want to talk about what we think of when we think about next generation vulnerability scanning. Sanjay, I'd love for you to cover this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talked about in terms of being able to have coverage everywhere, and really it's very difficult for teams to get the visibility they need around their assets, especially when talking about dynamic assets, right? There are a lot of virtual machines, cloud infrastructure, certainly mobile devices or remote workforce. Being able to track those and understand we've seen this device before is critical, because that reduces the workload of scanning that you have to do. It deduplicates assets I'm already aware of and I understand the security posture for. But again, those assets sort of change identity a little bit, right? They change IP address or they change MAC address, whatever it may be. And most legacy systems look at that and go, oh, okay, well, this is a new system that I need to understand the security posture of again. It's not really the case. And again, it adds workload to everything, people, the program, the process, the results, et cetera. So it's something that is really important as part of a next-gen system. The other part too is being able to group things and understand the criticality of the asset. So, a lot of vulnerability systems, whether it's based on pulling in threat intelligence, and we're seeing a lot of them use threat intelligence, they're still not really customized to the asset that they're scanning. So they don't still really understand. They go, well, here's a threat intelligence. Here's your vulnerability score. Now you figure out how to put those together, but we're giving you the data. That's not really effective in automating, how I'm able to understand these results and take action against them. So being able to do things like grouping and labeling, and again, really understanding the context that this is a critical database server sitting in my finance department. Something is going after that, or if that's vulnerable, I need to address that first. And more importantly, we're seeing an attack that's hitting those type of systems. Bringing all that together is very important for being able to prioritize remediation efforts. So we're, next gen system has to have that capability. Some of them are starting to get there. Of course, we have that capability to do that now, but we see where that data is still very siloed and not automated in a way that can help people be more effective. When we talk about, being able to do this active risk scoring, per organization, per subscriber, being able to understand your active risk, and this is where you're marrying the vulnerabilities, the threat intelligence, everything with your specific assets. We've talked about this a few times. That's an area that really people need to go to, right? That's the fastest thing that can accelerate remediation, because now I understand all this data in context of my environment. And that's really what's missing now, is that ability to do that. And again, solutions that can provide that capability are going to be key in accelerating remediation and scaling that remediation as we're talking about. The other part too that we've talked about, quite frequently, is the frequency of scanning. And the more maturity, the maturity scale that you provided can occur a lot faster if I know that my scanning capability is also going to minimize impact on my resources. People have short windows where they can do this, whether they're running a script, as you said, or whether they're business critical systems that, certainly IoT infrastructure, for example, I can't scan whenever I'd like to. I have to have very, very tight windows where I can do this because of the impact it has on performance. Well, because of that, we want to make sure that we can optimize the scanning for those systems, but that also lends itself to producing a low false positive rate. We talked about reams and reams of information around patches, et cetera. If I can reduce that count to really what's important and lower the false positives around things I don't need to know about or just even noise, that's going to allow a security team to be much more effective in terms of not only remediating their systems, but also understanding if there are other systems out there that they need to investigate, look for threats, et cetera, right? So again, I really want to reduce that noise. And the industry right now is not great about that. There are a lot of vendor claims about it being, very low, but the honest truth is it's about 20%, which is a very high number, right? If I'm adding 20% more garbage to the huge enough volumes I have to look at already, it just makes the problem, just untenable, right? I can't do anything about it at that point. So these are the types of things that are really critical to a solid vulnerability management system today versus some of the legacy solutions that are out there that have been around a long time, right? That have been modified to handle some of this, but again, they're being, they're modifications, and they come out and say, oh, we have this covered now, and really just kind of tweaked a few things to make it kind of work, but they're not really purpose built to handle these type of things.
Yeah, I think that false positive rate is one to key in on. Probably everybody that's listening right now has had a situation where they ran a vulnerability scan, gave the results out to somebody to go and remediate it, and then got the report back, well, actually, that device is patched. Maybe they sideloaded a patch or something along those lines, which sort of tricked the vulnerability scan into thinking it didn't exist, because all it was doing was looking at the knowledge base and seeing what applications were installed there, add remove programs for version control or something along those lines. So false positives are really, a great way to waste a bunch of time. And the better you can do with that, obviously, the better the results are going to be. Security tools, as we all know, are noisy as heck, and making them less noisy, I think, is super, super important. We don't have a heck of a lot of time left, and I do want to get through to some questions. So I'm going to move ahead to, let's talk about moving the needle. What does this look like if you actually implement it in practice? These are, high-level steps, but we really think these are the key ones to be thinking about. So, first off, you've got to understand the environment. So lay that foundation by really inventorying everything. So the assets that you need to scan, again, whether they exist at home, in the cloud, on premise, in a data center, and then define how important they are to your organization. This is just part of a good governance in general of a security program, but it also can dovetail into your information governance strategy as well. Knowing what data exists in certain places, how to classify that data, all of that's important for vulnerability scanning as well, because if you know that, your device happens to house sensitive PHI, for instance, it's got a higher criticality, and therefore the results of a vulnerability on that are probably more important to prioritize than they are, again, on a device that doesn't have that sort of stuff. So you establish that foundation, you start building upon that. You add that threat intelligence, and it's not really just the threat intelligence, but it's the relevancy to the organization that's important through what, Sanjay, you referred to on the prior slide as that active risk score. That will really tell you what's actively being exploited right now. Not just that it's got a high CVSS score, it might be that there's no proof of concept exploit kits that are out there in the wild. It might be that you can just go and download that off of GitHub. It might be that there's YouTube videos which will train somebody with zero sophistication how to exploit that specific vulnerability. That's the stuff to focus on, the stuff that's trivial to exploit and high impact to your organization. That enrichment will allow you to have the situational awareness that you really need to get, and that's only done through performing those scans against the entire environment. So have a plan for your remote workforce. If you're not scanning them today, you're definitely opening up areas of risk. I've seen this happen since the pandemic. We had a company that came to us for incident response. What ended up happening when we did the root cause analysis on it was effectively a user got phished. That phishing attack ended up exploiting a browser vulnerability, which allowed an attacker to get remote command control, that then they were able to pivot into the rest of the environment. Now, if they had been doing the proper things on that remote device, the remote workforce device around vulnerability scanning, remediation, and continuous monitoring, that situation wouldn't have happened. The situational awareness is really, really critical. That will allow you to focus on the priorities, right? So those things which are the highest risk, the exploitable vulnerabilities, the critical systems, focus on those. Don't just focus on the count. Don't just focus on the CVSS score. You track the right things at that point. You start tracking time to remediate. You're going to drive program maturity really, really quickly, just simply by pivoting how you're looking at this problem just a little bit. So, Sanjay, I'd love to get your thoughts before we open up to the audience for questions.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, what you got here is really a life cycle approach to it, right? It goes back to some of the things you already talked about around being able to have a proper program. And a lot of it is, you measure success, you continuously do that, but then you go back and you start again with understanding your environment, building threat intelligence and doing the scanning, et cetera, right? It's really around creating a scalable, sustainable program that continuously does this, whether it's automated or not, or some automation involved there, but being able to do that, continuously make sure that you're ahead of the game against what's going on out there, right? All the attacks that are going on. So, as much as this diagram is pointed as a moving the needle as a step-by-step program, it's also a continuous program. So, definitely agree. This is exactly the type of things that you want to kind of go and continue to do over and over again. And again, a program that can make that into an operational program and really, again, scale operationally to be able to handle that is key. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yep, I agree. Well, I hope everybody found that informational. I'm sure there's a lot deeper dive that we could give in any of these topics. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or of course reach out. Looks like we do have a few. So I'll go ahead and get us kicked off on the Q&A. So one question: how do we report cybersecurity to C-suite executives at a level they can understand? We get that question all the time. I think there are a couple of key things that you can be thinking about. First off, you don't want to be too technical, right? If you talk about CVSS scores and vulnerability counts and things like that, they're going to miss the point. Especially if you tell them, we've got 50,000 vulnerabilities, they're not going to know whether that's good or bad, or if the house is on fire and they need to call the cyber insurance and put a claim in. If you report it from the perspective of how are we doing against our peers, that's a good way to get some visibility at the board level. And there are ways that you can do that. I know Digital Defense has a capability built into a frontline that I think you guys call it the Insight Report, which will tell you, within that scanning tool, how you compare against organizations in your industry. That can be really impactful to a board because they'll look at that and say, well, I want to be better than our competitors, and I certainly can't be that much worse. So then we'll invest in actually improving that. I think you have to tie that with the mean time to remediate. So how are we doing against our peers, and how quickly can we remediate to close these gaps and get the overall program that much more healthy? They'll understand if you put that in sort of a trend line that shows, on day one, our mean time to remediate was 60 days, but on day 365, we brought that down to 5 days, let's say. Maybe you're not going to have that dramatic a delta, but that will be a pretty telling perspective to show that you had quite a lot of improvement in performance throughout the year. And probably along the way, you're going to see that ranking against your peers improve dramatically, simply because you're remediating that much more frequently. You're focused on the right thing. You have any other thoughts on that one, Sanjay?
No, I mean, that's definitely the goal, right? Is to be able to, when you're talking about a CISO and how you get the reporting there, it's really around how everything we're doing relates to the business, and being able to show how security has reduced your risk. That's going to show clearly how, again, we're reducing the impact of something, an external factor occurring, right, that we're hoping never does happen. but at the same time, being able to show that you've hardened yourself against that is really key. And that's really what a CISO has to show to the board very often is we've taken all the steps we can to make sure that our security program is effective at protecting our business. So, I absolutely agree. That's really what we have to do.
Yeah,
Tools that are going to
and
do that are effective.
I think another good way to look at that is sort of the aggregate risk score, right? So, some tools I know, again, Frontline allows you to do this, but that security GPA, which will give you sort of the health of the organization as a whole, boiled down into something that's as simple to understand as a GPA, right? Everybody knows what that is. If you get close to 4.0, you're doing a good job. That can also be helpful to articulate this in a manner that is just not the bits and bytes. You don't want to be talking about bits and bytes, but you want to talk about risk, and that's a good way to do it. Okay, let's take a couple more questions here. So, all right, question, what strategy would you recommend to get visibility into remote endpoint vulnerabilities? Yeah, there are some ways that you can go about doing this. So, if you're, let's start with the sort of traditional network-based scanning approach. So if you have a full tunnel VPN and all of your users are on a full tunnel VPN sort of at all times, you could adopt a network-based scanning approach where your centralized scanning engine, just like you would scan anything on a private network, can reach out to that private IP space, which is the VPN ranges, and scan them that way. I don't recommend that. It puts a ton of load on VPN concentrators, puts a ton of load on just the wide area network, and not the most efficient way to go about doing it. The way that I would probably recommend you do that is agent-based vulnerability scanning for those remote devices. That agent will be able to do a couple of things. First off, import the most updated signatures. Often it's going to be done either directly from the, some cloud-based centralized control or dashboard, or it could be done through like a proxy in the corporate network to ensure that there's still some central control from the corporate standpoint over, what's going to be scanned, the scan profiles are going to be used, the configuration benchmarks that we're going to scan against, stuff like that. The agent allows you to do, more than just the sort of probing of ports and protocols that network-based scanning might be able to do. It's much more akin to a credentialed scan than it would be to sort of your traditional uncredentialed vulnerability scan. That would be where I'd be looking, and that's certainly what we do with the Verdium resources. So that'd be my recommendation. Sanjay, I'm not sure if you've got additional ideas on that.
Yeah. No, I mean, you answer very well. I mean, the thing too is, having a truly cloud-based system too can be very helpful there, because as people are migrating their applications to the cloud and they're accessing corporate resource to their cloud, it's important to have a system that operates fully in the cloud, right? Because again, that's where things are going. That doesn't mean that cloud-based system can't handle on-premise things or whatever, but at the same time, they can also work with those agents more effectively as well to make sure that they're up to date and they're working properly, and also they're scanning the right things. So, that's a key piece of it as well. So yeah, other than that, no, you answered the question great. That's a big problem these days, and certainly something that has to be addressed.
Yeah, and again, it's got to be brought into that broader perspective, right? So there are different risk profiles, and frankly, the idea that you raised on one of the slides that you talked through, Sanjay, around dynamic asset grouping, I think that's super, super important, and probably the importance of it's lost a little bit because it just doesn't sound sexy at all. Dynamic asset grouping, big deal. But what that allows you to do is that asset group of your remote workforce, you can inspect them sort of as a continuum and look at that entire pool or that population of remote devices and manage risk in them differently than you might manage risk with some resources that are behind a firewall inside the corporate network. So it's helpful to get that perspective as well. And that comes back again to the reporting to, maybe not the board, but reporting on program performance in general. If you think about things in the context of their risk profile themselves, done in groups, I think that can really help, show where you've got to highlight, or put attention towards, driving risk down. So that's a key thing. So we're just about out of time. I think we've got time for one more question here. And looking through here, I see a couple that probably got asked at the beginning. So how frequently should I be scanning for vulnerabilities? Is keep pace with how quickly you can remediate. Drive that remediation time down and drive frequency up in accordance with that. What kind of reporting can I use to measure programs' effectiveness? Mean time to remediate, reduction in dwell time, overall risk score through something like a security GPA. That's a really good one. Other areas of reporting, Sanjay, you think are really important to call out?
Yeah, again, you mentioned that peer analysis too. That's always a good metric to see, because again, you can see relatively speaking how well your organization is protected compared to other ones too. So, that's a key one as well. But it does come down to just understanding again your active risks that are there. Seeing that risk score come down even at immediate level. So the combination of seeing what do I need to address immediately and also over time, what the trend analysis is there. So, even looking at these risk scores and security GPAs over time can be very helpful to see how well the security program is going. So it's a combination of both short-term and long-term views.
Yeah, I agree. I sort of I forgot about that that peer insight. That's super helpful, especially if you're trying to drive the board to give you additional resources, right? So that will be very, very impactful if you can show the board that we're not keeping up with our competitors. And as a result, the organization is at risk. That's the key thing, that because of this, the organization is at risk, and I can't guarantee results. I can't guarantee the protection of the organization. That will drive, additional investment into security. I think it's pretty clear, with some of the headlines that we have seen recently, that boards are interested in security now more than they've ever been. I've been saying that for a couple of years, but I think it's truer every day, and not more so than recently. And I think a lot of that comes down to the SolarWinds issue that made the news, and every board in the world was looking at that. Now, the interesting nuance about this, and I'd love to get your opinion here, Sanjay, is that because of the supply chain nature of that attack, those organizations that were keeping up with patching, right, which is always our recommendation, were the ones who actually put themselves at risk. What do you think about that? Is there something here for the vulnerability management program to solve, or is it really just that you kind of can't protect against a supply chain risk above and beyond just third-party risk management that needs to be done?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that is a big factor. At the same time, the patching effort is critical, right? Because as these things come out and now vulnerabilities are discovered, it's a combination of the threat intelligence piece in terms of really looking at what's going on out there. If there's a vulnerability that nobody knows about or a 0-day, it's very difficult to do anything about, right? If you don't know about it, it's tough to patch against it. But at the same time, it is also being able to effectively roll out those patches and understand those vulnerabilities as quickly as they come out. You made the great analogy there, right? Is that attackers will look at Microsoft Tuesday and start to build their attacks after Microsoft releases the vulnerabilities that are out there and even the patches out there. They know that there's a gap between the time the vulnerability is announced, the patch is created, and people implementing that infrastructure. So that gap in there is really what a lot of attackers take advantage of. In fact, a lot of attackers don't even know about the vulnerability until someone announces the patch for it. So, again, that's something where those systems can still be exploited if the security program hasn't become mature enough and it doesn't operate well enough to be able to shorten that remediation time. So again, that's all critical to this. Is there's always going to be cases where there are going to be things that we cannot hit immediately, but at the same time, we certainly don't want to leave them open, because that's where attackers are the strongest, is when those are left open for any sort of period of time.
Yeah, agreed. And it's funny about that Patch Tuesday. So, what you can often do, and certainly the sophisticated bad guys do this, is reverse the patch and figure out specifically what lines of code were changed. And that will give you a really good idea of what needs to be attacked to actually exploit the vulnerability for those unpatched systems. The window of opportunity that's given to the attacker between the time of the time of disclosure and the time of patch needs to be drawn down, and that's all about good governance and vulnerability management. All right, well, I've got, I think, time for one more question, and this one I get almost every time is, how much level of effort do you think I should allocate to this specific thing, to vulnerability management? It's sort of impossible to answer that question unless there's specific information about your case. What does your environment look like? From a hybrid cloud standpoint, on-prem standpoint, what operating systems are in place from a heterogeneous nature standpoint, or is it all sort of one type of operating system? Challenging question to answer. And if you've got that question, I'd love to have a conversation with you, because it's a problem that we can probably help you solve there. So, thank you to the audience, and Sanjay, of course, as always, thank you for participating in this as well.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate it.
All right, guys. Thank you.